Thank you, brother. That was very beautiful and an appropriate way to open this gathering. I want to just say a few words about the Contemplative Alliance. We see this as a think tank, and normally we sit together in a circle. So this is an unusual formation for us, and we want to make it as conversational as possible. Tomorrow we'll be able to sit in a circle together and have a deeper exchange. But today we want to put out the main themes. Most of our work at the Global Peace Initiative of Women was international and conflict areas. We sought to bring spiritual resources to people undergoing the trauma of conflict. And then in 2008, we realized that this country was in deep crisis. So we organized a gathering at the Aspen Institute, about 250 people from spiritual communities, to explore how we can gather the spiritual resources that were being generated in this country into a new coalition, which we ended up calling the Contemplative Alliance. Many of us have been focused on our own inner work over the past few decades, and there's a very deep and strong call now to bring that inner work to the reshaping of our society. And there's a great urgency to this. We all know the multiple crises we face. And as we continue to travel the world, we were in Greece in April, we were in Bhutan last week, having this dialogue everywhere because every place is in crisis. It's the ecological crisis, the economic crisis, the spiritual crisis. And yet there are tremendous spiritual resources that we all have access to. And so how do we collectively, the answer we feel has to be a collective arising now. It's not about any one tradition or any one leader. It's a collective arising. So as this think tank began to build, we've had 7 meetings. I think this is our 8th. And we thought to do it on a larger scale now. And in the next few days to see where we go from here. So there were three visions, I would say, that hold us together as a Contemplative Alliance. The first is the perception of the underlying unity of the spiritual traditions, of the religious traditions. It's a time to move away from the paradigm of separateness to the paradigm of unity and tap the underlying oneness while honoring and loving the distinctive nature of each of the traditions. So that was the first call, to tap into this unity and oneness. The second call was to tap into the sacred earth narrative, knowing that we have to as a society, have to change the way we interact with our beloved earth and all of the natural forces, come again into a sacred relationship. And then the third vision was the need to reshape the whole economic structure based on an understanding of the sacred earth relationship, or a relationship with the sacred earth. So these were the 3 areas that we began to meditate on and reflect on. And we hope that the day passes in a meditative space. And so you'll hear the gong from time to time. After each speaker, there's no need to applause. We want to go inside. So after the speaker, we'll have a gong, and then a few seconds later, because we don't have a lot of time, there'll be a second gong, which means that it's time to move into words again. So we want to hold the inner space as we work with the outer space. And the key for this Contemplative Alliance is working both in the inner and the outer, and how we can bring that together. We feel that this is the time for a coalition, for a partnership, for all of us who've been doing this work in various ways to come together now, so that we can have a collective role in reshaping society, so that it will be guided, this reshaping will be guided by spiritual principles. If they're not guided by spiritual principles, we don't see much hope for success. So it's time now for the spiritual communities, we feel, to move into a collective action that can help awaken these spiritual insights on a greater scale. So for this dialogue, we've partnered with our dear brother here, David Korten, who many of you may know. We were together in Washington in November the day after the national election for a small think tank on how to galvanize this spiritual energy. And it was there that we decided to come to New York and do something larger at the Morgan Library. So here we are together. So, David?
Thank you. I join in welcoming you all to this amazing gathering. I see our day here inspired very much by Thomas Berry's observation that when the stories by which a society lives are no longer adequate to the needs of their time, it can result in deep crisis. So we're here in search of a story adequate to lead us as humans, lead our path into what Thomas called the Echozoic era, a time when we humans learn to live again as indigenous peoples have done for eternity, to live in a partnership relationship, a responsible relationship to Earth community. We're at a point at which we face a choice. We can continue to use our knowledge and our technology to dominate and destroy Earth and thereby undermine our own future, or learn to use that knowledge and technologies in ways that nurture and continue creation's journey of discovery toward ever greater complexity, beauty, and possibility. But that latter path requires a sacred story true to the breadth and depth of human understanding of creation's grand journey and our human role in that journey. We believe that story is not going to be the product of an individual mind. It will not be the product of any particular group or meeting. It will ultimately must be a conversation of the whole involving millions, ultimately billions of humans as we re-explore and rediscover our place in creation. So thank you for joining us here, for bringing your wisdom, your experience, and your commitment to this sacred work.
I'm going to now ask Mary Evelyn Tucker to set the context for this narrative. Many of you know her work for the past 30 years on religion and ecology. She's been working on the sacred earth narrative for many, many, many years. And so I won't say any more. Mary Evelyn?
Thank you, Dina and David, and our distinguished panel, and all of you here who've made your many contributions over the years as well. I simply want to raise a few questions for our collective thinking, and that is the context in which we gather, the response that might be possible, and the role of religions. Our context, as we know, for this gathering is an environmental, social, economic crisis of massive proportions. Indeed, it is a planetary crisis, which we recognize around the world. As David said, this marks the changing of a geological era that Thomas Berry recognized from the Cenozoic to the Ecozoic. And now we have people in the geological community, Paul Crutzen, an atmospheric chemist, naming this the Anthropocene era, because this is the imprint of humans around the planet. So the context is a planetary crisis, and what is our response? I think it is to create a planetary civilization that is multicultural and multi-religious. This has been named by many as the Great Turning. David uses the term, Joanna Macy uses it, the Great Transition, Paul Raskin, and so on. So that those of us here engaged in religion have the possibility of giving birth to a new planetary culture, of shifting a mindset from destructive and devouring human-Earth relations to mutually enhancing human-Earth relations. How can we do that? As we all realize, culture is driven by stories that integrate worldviews and action, stories combining a cultural ethos with a comprehensive ethics. This is what Thomas Berry called a functional cosmology that evokes human creativity, the inspiration for the perspiration, a unifying story for the great work, the goal of which is creating the flourishing of the Earth community. Berry felt we needed this new story, and in 1978 he wrote his first essay on it, which later came out in The Dream of the Earth, 10 years later. He was calling for a new story, but he was also calling for a comprehensive ethics that went beyond simply the important ethics of homicide and suicide and genocide, but also biocide and ecocide, because that's the scale in which our dialogue emerges. So, what then of the role of religions? Where have the religions been and where do we need to go in responding to this huge planetary crisis? We can say in certain issues of peace and justice, the religions have been on board for some time. Ecology, they've been a little bit later, they're getting on board, but we need to be in touch with science and economics, which has been ahead of the game on ecology. We need to move beyond rhetorical statements and into engaged action, some of which has been happening. We definitely need humility, because religions are necessary but not sufficient for this great transition. We need the integration of contemplation and action, which is, of course, what this conference has a great gift to offer. And we need, I would suggest, the integration of ecology, justice, and peace, based on this deep contemplative space. So the integrity of ecosystems, social economic justice, democracy, nonviolence, and peace, the framing pattern of the Earth Charter, which came out of a decade of enormous work led by Stephen Rockefeller, but probably the most inclusive participatory civil society document we have. We can build on that. It's been adopted by the largest ecological organization in the world, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. UNESCO has adopted it. Certain countries have. Many religious communities have. We can support that and move forward as part of our efforts. Other expressions of this are awakening all around the planet of this new consciousness and conscience, that there is no future without a shared future, that we have unity within multiplicity and common but differentiated responsibilities. So how can religions contribute to move these efforts forward? Some individuals have been doing this as well. Hans Kung with his global ethics, Karen Armstrong with her charter of compassion, the extraordinary movement of indigenous peoples with the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Nature, with 30,000 people gathered in Cochabamba a few summers ago. So, there are ongoing efforts as well to move religions into this phase of an integrated vision of ecology, justice, and peace based on deep contemplation. With regard to peace, we have the interreligious dialogue that many of you here have been engaged in, including the Temple of Understanding, the Interfaith Center of New York, the World Conference of Religion and Peace. We have also contributions on economic and social justice, the bishops, the Jewish groups, the World Conference of Churches, and so on. Some of the key justice movements have been led in anti-globalization by David Korten and the International Forum on Globalization. Extraordinary contributions now emerging from economics, Peter Brown, Gus Beth, Bob Massey, and so on, many of whom are here. With regard to peace, I really want to reference as well Barbara Marx Hubbard's work years and years ago to call for a peace room, and her visionary, hopeful, and inspiring efforts for 40 years have been a great help to all of us. And with regard to ecology, we have the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, we have Green Faith, Interfaith Power and Light, and the contributions of hundreds of people in the Forum on Religion and Ecology for the last almost 20 years, now based at Yale. But we need to continue these lineages, build on them, grow them, expand them, help them. How can we link these movements, institutions, and organizations to science, policy, and economics? And clearly the economic link is going to happen here and has been ongoing. How might they be deepened through a link to contemplation? And how can we envision them, especially as part of a growing planetary culture that is being birthed, a culture of peace, justice, and integrity of creation? The Chinese, from government levels to academic levels, are calling this the birthing of ecological civilization. This is part of their policy, and it has been for at least a dozen years. This implies worldview, attitude and action, consciousness and conscience, this comprehensive compassion for the flourishing of life for future generations. This is not about us. It is about our children, our grandchildren, our students, and all future generations. A missing link is in this emerging planetary civilization is this unifying story that draws us together, recognizing differences but affirming that there is no future without a shared future. This unifying and engaging story to inspire hope and transformation is what Thomas Berry called for 35 years ago. And the Earth Charter phrases it this way: to move forward, we must recognize that in the midst of magnificent diversity of culture and life forms, we are one human family and one Earth community with a common destiny. What a magnificent line. All major institutions and individuals are being called to participate in the shaping of this story through their lens and with their creative insight and energy. We need this new story to orient us and guide us into this next phase of Earth's history. Journey of the Universe is one such offering, birthed over 10 years, 20 years, and so on. An overarching story of the fact that we are participating in a vast unfolding universe, birthed within a vibrant living Earth community. And the invitation is to participate in this unfolding universe, to expand it, to nurture it, to critique it. As David said, no one group or person can hold it. But this project of Journey of the Universe with scientists and ecologists is one offering into this conversation. Historians of World Religions. It is a PBS film. It's a Yale book. It's conversations with 10 scientists and historians and ecologists of how the great work is being inspired at this moment for this transition. People from the African American community, indigenous community, people working on food, agriculture, education are interviewed here to show that a story grounds our work and continues our energy. This week at the Chautauqua Institute, we have a conference of the Elegant Universe where the different world religions will respond to this shared story. In education, high schools and colleges are beginning to pick it up. In religious communities, discussion groups, and so on. Translations are emerging. So to conclude, this is a shared work, all of it. This effort for an inspiring and grounding universe story in search of a vision that we are all seeking for the sacred Earth community. If we see this as universe and Earth as sacred, we will be less likely to destroy it clearly. And Rachel Carson said the same thing 40 years ago. In fact, the question is, can we enter into the ultimate role of the human to renew the face of the earth? To renew the face of the earth. This is a spiritual task. We need spiritual energy. We need contemplation from all the world's religions, contemplation and action coming together. And then we can truly participate as co-creators in this magnificent, mysterious, and ongoing process. Thank you, and may your work and our collective work succeed. Thank you.
We're going to move into our first discussion group, which is on the new spiritual narrative of unity, and I'm going to ask Barbara Marx Hubbard to set the context for that. The spiritual landscape of America is changing, and she's so greatly loved for her work on evolutionary consciousness and seeing how the consciousness is evolving into a totally new paradigm, which is based on the underlying unity. And this is an issue that we come up against again and again, people finding it difficult to let go of the distinctions and how you balance the unity with diversity. And I think it kind of mimics the biology, where we value the tremendous life diversity and know it's all one living body. So nature can be our teacher on how we balance this unity and diversity. So Barbara, would you help us set the context? You can go there.
Thank you so very much, and I'm truly honored to be here at this auspicious and actually seminal occasion in the life of humanity. I just returned from the China Forum on Ecological Civilization, and Ervin Laszlo gave a very brief talk there in which he made the statement that he thought humanity had 5 years to make a shift in consciousness sufficiently strong to know we were going in the direction of an ecological civilization, which I think is a great phrase for it. And Ervin pointed out it's cultural toward ecological civilization. It's not just the environment. So I began to ponder what I think you can only see as an evolutionary mystery, as how the humanity could make a shift that quickly. Knowing what a stubborn species we are, to imagine anything in 5 years that you could say a shift had occurred. So here's what I came up with. First of all, on awareness, I call ourselves Generation 1. We are all the same generation, and we're all facing something new together at a global scale, which is to say nobody on Earth, as far as I know, has been through a crisis of this order, to shift a whole culture to a new phase of evolution, and by some, I would say, grace, are required to do it more consciously than has ever been done before. So that's the first thing I realized. And then I look back into deep time past for a clue as how has nature formed new whole systems out of separate parts for billions of years. The only difference is we're doing something consciously now. Nature has faced mass extinctions many times. And here's what I came up with, is the well-known awareness that it's every turn on the spiral. If you could put up my map of the spiral, please. Every turn on the spiral it has certain elements that are somewhat the same, that they're fractals. And what the learning is that when a system is far from equilibrium, small fluctuations are actually capable of having a much greater effect than they would in a stable condition. And if those small fluctuations are benign, every tendency in the system is to go to higher order. In other words, we're not just forcing it into higher order. It tends that way, but it needs to have a small fluctuation. And another word for that is a chaotic attractor. And I really like that word because I realize so many of us could be called chaotic attractors. There's a little bit of chaos there, but there's also a lot of attraction. And another word for it is strange attractor. And I was thinking of a T-shirt saying, "I'm a strange attractor, are you?" Because I thought, why am I so attracted? You know, for years and years and years, and why are we all so attracted? So what I really got from Ervin Laszlo also is that at the time of the great instability in what he calls a chaos point, the system inevitably tries to go back to try to stabilize. And that's an explanation of all the reactionary movements we have in politics and religions throughout the world. But it can't go back to stabilize. We can see that. What it has to do is seek a new structure. And he uses the word structure. It's not only just new consciousness. It has to have a systemic structure toward which to be attracted. And it's the same thing. If the structure is benign, it will go to a benign direction. If the structure is not benign, it will go to a devastatingly a painful direction. So here was what I came up to give a thought here, is what would it take to create a conscious nucleus of a chaotic attractor, to attract the whole system. In a way, that's what we're doing here. We're saying if everybody who already is moving in the direction towards sustainability, ecological civilization, justice, peace, order, and vision of our potential as a species, if everybody on Earth had some way of self-organizing and self-mapping, not in any single organization, but in an organism that transcends anybody's organization, that it might actually be the attractor that would move the system in that higher order. And my thought is there are enough people already feeling this way, already knowing aspects of this way in every field. And the reason for that map, you can't see it too clearly, but there's health, education, economics, science and technology, justice, environment, all the organic functions of humanity. If you could think for just a moment of all the people we know who are moving in that direction of evolving every system on Earth, it's not just individuals, it's systemic, because top-down systems are breaking down everywhere, and new systems are emerging everywhere, but we haven't yet seen ourselves as a whole. And with every part of the individual as well as every systemic change as being part of a living system, which is what I think it is. So the question that I'd like to raise is, what would it take to issue a call to humanity to self-map on a new organism? What would it take to make a call on some type of yet to be conceived of, but not at all inconceivable, a systemic type of mapping function on some internet where it literally was not owned by any organization, but was an organism, perhaps sponsored and supported by many different people, that has inherent within it the new story of the evolution of humanity to be a whole greater than the sum of its parts. And one thing that we've learned from evolution is the amazing fact that when nature hits a crisis, it tends to jump to a more complex whole system. And it is always unpredictable and different from the sum of its parts. So there's a vision in here in the story that we haven't seen yet, but that I'm sure is innately attractive, because it would be a representation of the system as a whole. And Earth life as a whole, Mother Earth is giving birth to a species capable of coevolution. That in itself is a remarkable thing. And how many of us, I think there are millions of us, and we're usually not wedded to some specific organization, and no matter what religion we come from, we feel that we're part of a greater whole, and we want to bring whatever part we're in into that whole. So I'm going to make a suggestion that there's a call to humanity to fulfill the promise. And the promise is the promise of becoming a new whole, greater than the sum of our parts, that we have not seen before. And that we should aim within 5 years. This is taking Irvin's 5 years because it's so short as to be incredible. That there would be a massive call to place ourselves on the map so we could get a first picture of humanity's creativity, wholeness, and oneness for the first time. As great a picture as when the astronauts took the first picture of Earth from space. There were no people on that picture. There were no living systems. There was no awareness of the struggle that was going on. There's some kind of work of art with a call to everybody who feels attracted to create a strange attractor and have some kind of event in 5 years that we would have to build up to as humanity's first great work of art. And the work of art is the whole system that we're attracted to creating that we have never seen before. I mean, when I got that thought, because I was invited to come here, I thought this is the first time I've ever suggested it. And I'm a little breathless because I would like to take one last minute for us to just imagine every one of us here and every one of us that we already know of all over the world being invited to place themselves and their gift to humanity in some type of organic site where there could be plenty of websites where you would look into the connection of everybody, but you wouldn't have to tell everything on every entry. And there would be a fostering of synergistic convergence. Nature is a hierarchy of synergies. Even though it's very hard for the human race to synergize, nature has been doing it for billions of years. Separate parts come together and form wholes greater than the sum of the parts by some magnificent organic coordinating quality of nature itself. Now, the only difference is we have to do it consciously. And it may well be that the meaning of the crisis we're facing is the conscious evolution of humanity. Because if we didn't have a crisis at this scale, it's very hard to see how we'd ever do this. And then we just go down as a whole. So we needed, from an evolutionary point of view, a crisis great enough for enough people to say, if we don't do something, we will self-destruct our Earth life. It has to be great to get a species as difficult as we are to move. And I believe the strange attractor would be to create a story created by the peoples of the world, of the vision of what a new whole would be. And to make, I said this to Frank Phoenix, who first engaged me on the idea of the importance of the new story as a shared effort. And we had a lot of problems over the new story because everyone said, well, it's certainly not going to be white Americans who are going to tell the new story. We ran into a lot of trouble because we were all white Americans talking about the new story. And what we realized, it has to be the story of the peoples of Earth, but it needs to be a context to look for a whole greater than the sum of our parts. And we need the imagination to reimagine the world. And we have to call upon the greatest, deepest artistic impulse to place our gift in such a way that we'd be the second generation of astronauts and cosmonauts. We're going to get a picture because seeing is believing. And if any one of us could see the magnificence of the initiatives of humanity all over the world, connected as a whole system, I believe we would be so thrilled, excited, and attracted that in 5 years we'd be on another track towards ecological civilization. Thank you.
We're going to now have comments from our discussion group up here, and so I'm going to ask first Pirzia Nayat Khan to offer your reflections based on what we've heard.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm very inspired by the opening remarks, and Barbara Marx Hubbard has just reinforced our sense of the urgency of a transformation at the global scale, and also encouraged us by the hope that greater and greater mutual recognition by the peoples of the world coming together as a mosaic of humanity, that this possibility contains the promise of a new wholeness. You used such words as the whole and organicity, and these words, I think, add nuance to the word unity, which could too easily be interpreted as uniformity. And we are seeing the proliferation of unities in the form of monocultures that more and more remake the world in one image. We are seeing the lessening of diversity. So it seems to me that in our conversation this morning, that is not the unity that is the subject of our great hope. We are imagining a unity within diversity, which is to say wholeness or organicity. And it seems inevitable that in some fashion or another, the great world religions are going to have to more and more come to terms with each other. They have lived in uneasy conjunction side by side over the centuries, but in today's interconnected world, connected by patterns of immigration and communication, and particularly the very rapid communication technologies of today, the old certainties are breaking down, and new interactions are taking place all of the time, which present us with new questions. And therefore, pluralism, inclusivity, is the order of the day, clearly, but there are different paths toward inclusivity. And among these, we may note, first of all, the secular approach, which tends to see the different religions as a variety of cultural expressions, and which welcomes diversity, sees diversity as a good in itself, but doesn't place any special importance upon the truth claims that the religions themselves present. The secular approach sees religions more or less as folklore and valuable as cultural artifacts. Whereas the religious position is very different. The believer believes that the religion to which he belongs or she belongs is a source of profound illumination. It derives from revelation or from enlightenment, and it has a message which is of urgent relevance to life on earth. Now, this vision of inclusivity, that which comes from religion, has its own limitations. Its strength is in its deep acknowledgement of the sacred and of the transcendental mystery at the heart of creation. Its limitation is that the religious approach to inclusivity tends to prioritize the form of one's own faith and recognize other faiths to the extent to which they seem related or comparable, and tends to reach the conclusion that religions are acceptable to the extent that they approximate one's own faith in its familiar forms. And so one sees the variety of religions as more or less good approximations of one's own faith. So each of these positions has its strengths and limitations. The secular pluralism with its radical openness, but lack of a deep acknowledgement of the sacred essence of revelation and enlightenment. And the religious approach, which takes very seriously these things, and therefore too often falls prey to intolerance and even violent conflict. So what we are seeking in our age, I believe, is a reconciliation of these approaches. Radical openness, but an openness that is grounded in an experience of the sacred which is rooted in a contemplative understanding. And that contemplative understanding can only arise from practice, from spiritual practice, from prayer, from meditation, from silence, from attunement, from these methods of transcending the boundaries of our conditioned individual selves and accessing something greater. So I believe that these possibilities are emerging through the encounters that this gathering represents. And more we may see that the religions together can form one body. This was the message of Sadi, the great Persian poet, in a verse which is displayed in the United Nations, in which he said that all of the children of Adam are one body, and if one part of that body is in pain, the whole body must feel that pain. We know that if our foot is injured, we feel it all throughout the body. It isn't only the foot. And so all of the religions are like limbs, organs, parts of the spiritual body of humanity. And in every part, in every cell, the DNA, the code of the whole humanity exists. So each religion possesses in its essence the whole truth, and yet every cell acts upon that DNA in a manner that is specific to its part within the whole. It selectively draws from that code so that it can join with others in uniting in the wholeness of a body which is organic. It isn't homogeneous. So it seems to me that this model, the organic model, which is so relevant to the ecological challenge and opportunity of our time, is equally illuminating of the spiritual challenge of reconciling and harmonizing the faiths. And that one body, the body of which all of the religions belong, I would name the body of love itself. That love which rises out of eternity, emerges through the expanse of the cosmos, and which quickens us through evolution, self-emergence, and the strange attractor which Barbara Marx Hubbard so meaningfully mentioned this morning. So, thank you.
We'll now ask Shraddha Luvanade from the Sri Aurobindo Ashram to build upon the conversation.
Listening to the presentations earlier, I was drawn to a curious paradox. What is it in the strange attractor that draws the chaos around it and puts it in order? What power does it contain that can overcome the compelling, destructive, inevitable tendency of chaos? Not only overcome it, but also introduce an element of a deeper knowledge which knows exactly how to arrange that chaos, to draw order out of it. Where is that knowledge hidden? Where is that power? And the solution to that comes only when we look at what exactly we mean by this oneness. We tend to think of oneness as an idea, as an abstraction, as something out there that we have to reach out and seize and bring into our lives. But the reality is that this oneness is immanent. It is here. It is in everything. It is the very essence of everything. There is no other. It is in this way that our ancient rishis described that oneness. There is no other. It is immanent, and therefore it is also at the very heart of every atom, at the very heart of emptiness of space. And yet, we find that it tends to fulfill itself in diversity. As a oneness, it is not a flat uniformity. It is all potential, infinite potential, ananta guna, as they said, unendingly unfolding qualities. And it seeks to fulfill itself in infinite diversity, unendingly, never repeating. And yet at the heart of that diversity, in each facet of it, it is secretly present. And therefore, in that oneness, we see not only the power to burst out into this rich universe, beautiful universe, wonderful universe that we see, but we also see in it the capacity to draw it all together, perfectly express itself in order or in chaos, as it chooses. That oneness is not a blank mechanical reality. It is utterly conscious, and it chooses consciously. And that is the reason why we find this universe is so beautiful. If it was merely the outcome of chaos arranging itself into order by chance, there was no reason for it to be beautiful. Everything in the universe, without exception, is beautiful. It's only when the human mind enters into the game that we can create ugliness. And even that ugliness can be seen to be beautiful from certain perspectives. They are just exceptions to the beauty. When we dwell on these ideas, something interesting comes forward. And that is, our deepest essence is also the same oneness. If it is the essence of it all, if it is the essence of the whole universe, it's also our essential identity. And when this question is put, you saw the beautiful picture of evolution there. What drives evolution? What drives us? It is that immanent presence of that oneness. It is us. It is our own fulfillment that's unfolding in what we call evolution. It's not something other. And when we look to the future, the ecological civilization that we are drawn to create, it's not something we're going to put together by our own conceptually imposed ideas. It's something that's going to unfold from deep within our hearts, from within all of our hearts together. And the beauty of it is that if each one of us were to follow the natural line of unfoldment of their deepest truth, we would find ourselves spontaneously in harmony. Because the underlying source within each one of us is the same, is identical. And therefore, when it unfolds in our hearts, it cannot enter into conflict. Conflict happens only when we lose our synchronization with it. When we go off track, when we lose that connection, that thread of the natural unfoldment of that truth. And therefore, when we seek to create, when we envision a new ecological civilization, I would say even the vision emerges in our minds from that source. And when we work towards it, Rather than struggling with our own preconceptions, perhaps the easier way might be simply to let go and turn deep within, find our reconnection with that source and allow it to unfold, allow it to lead. And perhaps then things might happen much smoother, much faster, much more spontaneously and beautifully. We also realize, dwelling on this idea, that the nature of this underlying oneness is unconditional love. For how else can you relate to yourself when all is held in an underlying oneness? How does the oneness relate to itself, to its own infinite diversity of forms, except in an utter self-giving, which is unconditional love? And therefore, when we align ourselves to that deeper identity, which is ourselves, our natural relationship with all things is one of unconditional love. It's not something one has to create, it's not something one has to pretend or impose. It is something one uncovers, discovers, recovers in a different way. The difference, though, today is that when we discover it consciously, we become conscious participants in this evolution. And what took billions of years to bring us to where we are can now move forward rapidly, consciously, with perhaps greater potential for diversity, and yet holding that greater diversity in still a greater underlying oneness. And it is this which is the pointer for the immediate future of humanity, that so far we had separated the spiritual from the material. We had brought in an artificial division in reality. And now it's time to reunite all of reality in our experience. Realize and manifest the spiritual in matter, in what may be called a divine materialism. Sri Aurobindo observes that in the unfolding future of evolution, evolution itself will evolve. Because a new principle is now introduced in evolution, a principle of knowledge. We can consciously reach into the very principles and processes and laws of evolution and change them consciously. One can even say the fulfillment of that underlying oneness moves forward another step of its self-expression. What is evolution after all? That oneness secret hidden behind the chaos, gradually pushing itself forward, emerging and revealing itself. That's the secret of the strange attractor. It is the oneness pushing itself forward, drawing together the chaos to release, express itself in forms of beauty and divinity, perfection and love. The effort necessary for us is only to tap into our own deepest strange attractor, deep within our heart, and the rest can follow beautifully, joyously.
Sharon Salzberg from Insight Meditation. Add your reflections.
Thank you so much. There were actually two streams of things that were going through my mind in listening. One actually was a memory of maybe 15 years ago or more. I was at a conference in San Francisco, wonderful conference with tremendous speakers and presentations, and yet the single biggest takeaway that happened for me, the most profound moment, happened backstage when I overheard a conversation that I wasn't even a part of. I was walking by a group of people, which included the writer Alice Walker, and I overheard her saying to this group of people, as I get older, the single most important thing for me is good-heartedness. And then I walked on. And out of all of the talks and the lectures and the presentations and the wonderful moments, that was it. And I come back to it over and over again, this idea of good-heartedness, the realization of good-heartedness as being what unites us, what our priority can be. I personally don't actually think that much in terms of religion. I think much more in terms of contemplative traditions, because I see the whole variety of contemplative traditions as the place where it's like that's where the alchemy happens. That's where our abstract ideals, where our values, the ways we want to live can be made real. That's the place where we can breathe life into those concepts, because the process of living those truths is in part a cognitive one of greater understanding and recognition of how things are. In part, it's a collective journey as we support one another. And it's very much an emotional journey. I was sitting here, just in the time I've been sitting here, realizing that I have watched displayed in my mind tremendous inspiration and faith and some flashes of real despair, like 5 years. That's not very long. A little bit of anxiety from that, you can even say panic, like a moment of panic. Determination, despair, like where is this going to come from? Regret. Why haven't I done more before, right? So there's been a lot going on in me, and I think in us as we receive these words. And so what do we do with all of that? Like, how do we go forward when we're actually kind of anxious? And how do we find one another when we're feeling hopeless? The task at hand just seems too overwhelming. How do we deal with the feelings of powerlessness? How do we deal with the recognition maybe we don't really want to share any power? That we're not ready to make sacrifices. So all of that is a lived realm of spiritual tradition, of contemplative tradition. And in our journey toward living good-heartedness more and more and more, that's where I see this tremendous wealth of knowledge that may have different forms, may have different expressions. It certainly does, different methodologies, and so on. But I think that's the essential point, that these are the traditions that have for sometimes thousands and thousands of years been working in just that place. How do we really live what we care about? How do we find one another, and how do we bring these changes about? So that's really what I've been thinking about.
Father Michael Halloran is both a Catholic priest and a Zen sensei. So he holds two traditions. This is the future.
Evolution, right? Christianity has often been accused, and rightly so, in the Western civilization of raping the earth and taking one verse, as Joan Chittister recently said, dominate, dominate the earth and subdue it from the book of Genesis. But that's only one reading, and it's not the most profound reading of what actually is there in the tradition. The very book of Genesis itself gives an evolutionary view, much as evangelicals dislike admitting it. The 7 days unfolding actually is, if you like, an evolutionary view, and also a view of connectivity, of integration, of harmony, of how we all do fit in together. All the animals and the plants, human beings, we are all part of one universe. And there are wonderful traditions. The Greek fathers of the 4th century, a wonderful theologian and a father of the church in the 7th century, Maximus the Confessor, which sees the whole universe as a dance, or as a liturgy, as a celebration, as a worship celebration, dynamic, all the elements working together, coming down from God, from the Absolute, and returning there. The Neoplatonic view almost as well, integrated into that. And this is mainstream Christianity. This is the mainstream Western tradition, which in essence is what it's really all about, but which has been lost in popular consciousness. And you don't have to go to the edges of Christianity to find this magnificent, all-inclusive evolutionary view. You just have to recover it there in the tradition, which antedates the separation of Eastern and Western churches and Protestant and Catholic and that whole thing. And the Middle Ages is another wonderful example of St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, the Franciscan school, of the unification of all of creation, the scale, the ladder of being, the interconnectedness of everything in one cosmic dance. These are wonderful insights that need to be recovered. And what I discovered in my study of all this and in my spiritual practice as a monk was that this attached, these fathers of the church in the Christian tradition were attaching to the Jewish mystical tradition, which became the Kabbalah. And there's an esoteric strain which then goes all the way back and goes all the way through, which is basically suppressed in the last 500 years, but which is very powerful. And the basic vision of the basic esoteric vision, which is cross-cultural and cross-religion, is of this unity, as above, so below. We're reflections of the Absolute, and we return to the Absolute. As within, so without. The image of the temple, for example, as being the whole universe, as being the spiritual world, as being the inner world. All these different levels are interrelated and interconnected. I've often thought in recent years that the recovery of this esoteric mystical tradition, which is foundational and mainstream, is one of the ways, perhaps one of the privileged ways that the traditions can encounter each other. So I put it this way. In recent years in the West, we've spoken about orthodoxy, which is right thinking, and there's altogether too much thinking. Giving way to orthopraxy, which is right practice, working for justice and peace, as Mary Evelyn pointed out. Also, as she mentioned, wonderful Karen Armstrong and her Charter of Compassion. And compassion is where we all need to end up, love, etc., as has just been mentioned, where we need to wind up both practically speaking, but also as the essence of every religious tradition in practice. And if we wind up there, it'll be the validation of the validity, certify the validity of our tradition, because if we don't wind up there, we're not practicing it right. That's where all traditions, as she says, do need to come. But I'd like to speak about this transformation of consciousness then. I think I'm introducing a word here, orthonoia. Orthonoia, which is right consciousness, which of course is one of the spokes of the wheel of the Dharma in the Buddhist tradition as well, one of the eightfold path, right consciousness. Orthonoia, metanoia in the Christian Greek tradition means repentance, transformation. It literally means getting beyond the mind or changing the mind, metanoia. So that's the way we need to repent and change now, is have orthonoia, a new consciousness, a right consciousness, which is precisely this esoteric but profoundly mainstream consciousness of as above, so below, as within, so without, all things interconnected, all things as one. And that's the way they are, as Schroederloo says. We don't create it, it emerges. It's what we are, it's what the whole thing is. The whole cosmic dance is that oneness manifesting and then returning to the one. And that's the evolutionary task as well. So orthonoia, you might also call it orthocardia, the right heart, but that brings us right back to compassion and the practice. So then my question would be, or my recommendation would be, how do we get to this orthonoia? This is the spiritual practice that we've just heard about. These tie into remarks I made recently in Bhutan, that we all need to go out of ourselves, go out of our phenomenal, in the worst sense of the word, egos, get out of our false consciousness, get out of our limitation, and get out of our illusion into a desert or liminal experience somehow, to wrestle with the demons of fear, of arrogance, greed, hatred, and ignorance, according to the 3 poisons of the Buddhist tradition, the 7 capital sins, if you will, in the Christian tradition, but to wrestle with all the illusion that is there, to transform our consciousness, to get orthonoia, this is the spiritual journey, this is the spiritual task, and as has rightly been said, if we don't do this vital, critical inner struggle, if we don't engage in this, and there's no chance for change, we'll remain just as separate, just as fearful, just as violent as we always were. So we need to do this, and in that process, and as part of that process, we encounter whatever you want to call the absolute, the oneness, the emptiness, as even the Kabbalah calls it, ayin, emptiness, the Christ consciousness. And we need to recover cosmic consciousness, which is all over the New Testament, cosmic Christ consciousness, which nobody ever talks about in the Christian tradition, but which is central. Once again, we have to recover what's mainstream right there in St. Paul. Christ, cosmic consciousness, is what it's all about. Christ who fills all things, the universe and all its parts. We have the mind of Christ, as St. Paul says. Or Buddha nature, Buddha consciousness, Atman, Brahman, however we manage to later conceptualize it or present it, actually to have the experience then of that encounter with who we really are, our true nature in Christ or in Buddha nature, of that connection, of that oneness with the Absolute, and then to bring that gift to the world. It's a monastic ideal, really. But as I always like to point out, we all have the inner monk, we all have the archetype of the monk within us. Even the tarot says that, the hermit, you know. The point is we need to recover that inner vision, that inner experience of connection with the Absolute, with our true nature, with everything, and all 3 are coterminous. You can't have one without the other 2. And then in that vision, that esoteric vision, that practical vision, to have orthonoia, to really recover the kind of consciousness we need to move forward, this evolutionary consciousness, and then present that to the world. That will be our task, and that's what we need to present to the world as we move forward. So I hope that's what we can aim for. And as in this process, we'll discover our unity with the different traditions as well. Different ways, different approaches to one ultimate mystery. And have instances of what my friend and mentor Paul Knitter calls double belonging or triple belonging, as Dina just pointed out, where you can respectfully approach and savor many traditions, several traditions at a time, and taste the wisdom that each has to offer as expressions of this great mystery of the divine, of life, whose dance of love and dance of life we all share in, and hopefully we can consciously foster as well. Thank you.
I want to now pull out one thing from each of you and then pose a question. Pirzia spoke about each religion possessing the whole truth. I think the acknowledgement of that is part of the paradigm shift. Because 90% of the human community has lived under this impression that only their tradition possesses the truth. For everyone else has to either be changed. It's a control mentality. It's the same thing as the control of the planet. Impose my vision on others. So that shift alone is monumental, acknowledging that each religion possesses the whole truth. Shraddha talked about oneness pushing forward evolution, and I think that's what many of us are experiencing now without being able to understand it fully, this push that we feel toward growth, that we must evolve as a species, evolve or perish. Sharon spoke about contemplative practice being the alchemy, and I think so many people resonate with that. I don't care what we call it. So many people today don't feel bound by a religion, but they know, they have the experience that contemplative practice is an alchemy. It transforms consciousness. It works. So that's part of the new narrative, is that all we need to do is go inside. We don't need externals. We need to go inside. And then, Michael, this leads to the question, as it is within, so it is without. Therefore, the chaos, the pollution, the disasters we see without are a reflection of the inner life of the human community. So what does that say about our inner life? I've always seen this crisis as essentially a spiritual crisis, and all the others as manifestation of a great disconnection at a spiritual level. So can we comment on what is happening inside that is being reflected in the multiple crises we see? Because the function of this group is to look at the inner world, look at our inner lives, and what's awry that needs to be alchemized. Who wants to go first? You can just pick up the microphone if you want to speak.
Just a few thoughts on that. I think the predominant negative inner experience that governs, as I've sometimes said, 95% of what people do is fear, a deep anxiety, fear of the other, fear of oneself, fear of God, especially the way sometimes God has been presented. So to deal with the fear, and then that fear and the anxiety, is mirrored in the confusion and the chaos outside, and that through contemplative practice, through the feeling, because fear comes from isolation, fear comes from feeling alienated, fear comes from feeling alone. So contemplative practice can directly transmute alchemically the fear by an experience of connection, of oneness, ultimately with everything, absolute, with ourselves and with others. So I think that psychologically and spiritually speaking, that's what needs to be primarily addressed, that existential fear, angst, the isolation, the desperation that leads to the grasping and the greed and the violence that we see manifest in our society and on our planet.
I'd like to just mention evolutionary spirituality, that if you look at the core of the spiral of evolution coming from the mind of the cosmos, the mind of God, and that jump from eternity to evolution right there, that every single turn on the spiral was animated by Aurobindo's phrase, consciousness force. And consciousness force has direction, progression toward more complexity and higher order. So for me, the spiritual path at the right of that hub of that wheel is is the impulse of evolution incarnate collectively as our deepest impulse to express, to create, and to evolve beyond where we are. And so I want to just put forward the practice of contemplative evolutionary spirituality as possibly a context in which all forms of contemplative spirituality could contribute as something so much greater than the sum of our parts, because it is toward emergence that is actually at the root of all great traditions. So possibly the mystical, when combined in the evolutionary, knowing that core of the spiral is the God force, now becoming conscious in us to co-create with. I'd just like to offer that as a context.
I want to kind of build up on this fear, because I think fear is pervasive in our society. It's even used. It's used politically. It's used on many levels. And how do we get out of that spiral? I mean, how do we talk about it publicly and address it?
Well, it seems to me that if we are to respond constructively to the great challenge before us, which asks of us to move beyond ways of life which more and more we realize are destructive to Earth's living systems, we do need to overcome the fear of what is unknown. We need to cease to feel fixated, addicted to what is familiar to us, and relearn ways of life that our ancestors knew, but which have become very strange and unfamiliar to us. So there is a factor of fear there, but also the need to be able to envision something else. I see it as a kind of renunciation. We're being asked to give up certain things, and we want to hold on to those things until we see something better, something that can be more fulfilling. We don't want to give up privileges, forms that seem to us natural and necessary as a result of our conditioning in contemporary society. If we are to embrace a new vision, it has to draw us to renounce what we have in favor of something more satisfying. So the renunciation of materialism, of a reaching after things to possess them, a throwaway culture of consumption, can only be superseded by a more fulfilling vision of life. We can't force people to renounce what they consider their only source of satisfaction, unless something more satisfying can be revealed. And in the Sufi tradition, there are degrees of renunciation, and the first renunciation is the renunciation of material things. But that renunciation cannot be forced. It's only possible when one sees that there is something more satisfying, and that is the inner sensations, that is intellectual pleasures, spiritual pleasures, contemplation, poetry, philosophy, music, and so forth. But that itself requires a further renunciation, which must be renounced in favor of what is still more essential, which goes beyond good and bad, pleasure and displeasure, and that is the experience of divinity itself, the great whole. And even that must be renounced, because we make an idol, we make an image of that divine, and we cling to it as a picture of reality, but that picture of reality must be shattered. There must be a further renunciation. So there is a cycle, a series of renunciations, but these renunciations can never be enforced. They're only possible when what is behind begins to dawn. And so what we're talking about here, I think, is to articulate what is behind what we know, so that we can be drawn to it and lovingly give up those things that are not serving us and serving the planet, and take up with relish that which is still more meaningful.
And in the larger perspective of time, we see an inevitable rhythmic cycle of oneness diversifying, followed by the diversity being reunited, reintegrated in a more complex unity. And there are cycles within cycles. So while there may be a large cycle of multiplicity emerging, within that there are sub-cycles of multiplicity and reunification, multiplicity, unification, and cycles within cycles within cycles. Every time though, when there has been a sufficient development of or enrichment of diversity, it tends to lose connection with the unity. And therefore the second movement must start drawing all the threads back together. The present crisis, the present transition of humanity is the greatest unification of the largest diversity created so far. That's why it's so painful, that's why it's so hard, that's why it's so rich in its conflicts. And as if at the last stage of this diversification, there has been this hard division between the East and West, between materialism and spirituality. And this was necessary because each of these facets had to be explored to its full, their potential drawn out to the maximum, and then only the reconciliation, reunification taken up to create a greater richness. And so we are at that point of transition where the most extremes of human experience are being brought together, and necessarily it creates the sense of greatest clash, greatest conflict. And the necessity for us today, therefore, is somewhere to let go of the forms and catch the deeper inner underlying essence, which is formless, and allow new forms to emerge through this crisis. The error we make is to look back at the past to see what worked and try to repeat that and repeat that harder. And that's not going to work. Every system that was created in the past was useful in that context, and in the present it is bound to fail. And we're moving into a framework of organization which is less systemic, less structured, more spontaneous, more true, both individually and collectively, something which has never been done before perhaps, in this way, at least on this scale. And there's a lot of letting go required, and reconnection to the only thing which is true, that's the essence deep within us.
Sorry. I was also thinking that perhaps disconnection, profound disconnection, is producing that fear. And ironically, I think we're also disconnected often from the fear. Like we don't even really know what we're feeling. And our actions are born out of that disjunct between what's motivating us and what we recognize consciously. And certainly we're disconnected from one another. I think society is clearly, in many places, come to a situation where there's tremendous isolation, and people feel tremendous isolation and tend to isolate others as well as we declare the other in a variety of different ways and for different reasons. But it's also ironic because we live in a time where interconnection, I think, is so clearly evident, not only from a spiritual perspective, but from a very secular understanding. Economics shows us this, and environmental consciousness shows us this, even epidemiology shows us this, that what happens over there doesn't nicely stay over there and keep from bothering us over here. We live in a world where there's such evident connection everywhere, and yet a time also where there's such tremendous increasing isolation.
Let orthonoia replace paranoia. I mean, that's a good point.
I think we might add the noosphere into this, that the amazing growth of a planetary nervous system in the last 10 years is truly remarkable. And if Teilhard de Chardin was intuitive about this, he felt that when we connect heart with heart and center with center, within that thinking new global brain, mind, heart, that it would lead to a collective awakening of that planetary nervous system. And that he called it the Christification of the earth as a Jesuit priest. But we're calling it many other things, like a planetary awakening, or many, many words. But let's remember the noosphere, and your wonderful phrase, orthonoia. And to some degree, that Facebook is the third largest nation in the world. Now, it can be funny and silly, but maybe the planet knows what it's doing. It has to develop a nervous system so that the chaotic attractor can communicate fast.
Well, thank you for bringing Teilhard into the conversation, because of course he's a great inspiration for Journey of the Universe. But I also wanted to bring in action. And I look over there at Arthur Waskow, who's been at this for 40 plus years, and I think is an example of someone, you know, putting together contemplation and action. And I look at Professor Chung from Union, who did this outstanding talk in Canberra at the World Conference, WCC conference years ago, bringing spirit and really upsetting the whole conference. But I want to just also bring into the conversation some of the precedences that can help. And that is, intellect and contemplation matter. So I don't want to leave intellect out. And there's hundreds of people who've been working on these issues in academia who need the contemplation perhaps, but are very active participants in this. And it builds on, you know, in the early 90s, Stephen Rockefeller started a conference at Middlebury called Spirit and Nature, and there was one on the West Coast called Earth and Spirit by the Chinook community in Seattle. 1,000 people came to these things, okay? The Forum on Religion and Ecology was picking up on this energy in the mid-90s and doing these conferences that did exactly what Michael said, that there's retrieval, re-evaluation and reconstruction of these traditions in our times. And you know, there's books, there's websites, there's a lot of material to draw on here. And as well, I really want to put in the conversation that unless we're speaking to the David Cortons and the people in different disciplines, we may still end up speaking to ourselves. And you know, we tried to do a big conference at the Natural History Museum. Again, 1,000 people came. This was in 98. There's energy here, and I think there's a timing that David is also pointing towards, and Barbara's been doing this for 100 years, and you all have been doing it for 150 years. But I want to put into the mix here this tremendous sense of contemplation, action, and intellect. You know, we need powerful intellect along with these other things. I don't think we have any disagreement here, but there's a lot of resources that we can draw on for this. At the heart of the matter, and Dina, this is why I congratulate you for joining us, is the transformation at such a deep level that you all articulated so well. And how can we intersect, of course, is what Barbara's talking about as well.
I want to just refer to something that Pirzia said about communication, really, because we are at a point where dramatic shifts are going to be needed, required, and that awakens fear, because who's articulating it in a positive way? There's so much fear about what the future holds, and it must be presented as an advance, not a regression. It's not a loss of lifestyle, it's a reclaiming. So much has been lost. I mean, who thinks about beauty in our society? The role of the arts has been way demoted. I mean, beauty used to be a central value. It's of very little value in our society today. Community, the whole sense of community, which Sharon referred to, has been lost. So one of the challenges tomorrow is can we come together around a language? I mean, this needs to be articulated to a greater public in an evolutionary way as a society that's evolving beyond many bad habits, letting go of many bad habits that have been destructive to ourselves in addition to the planet. So if anybody wants to comment on this positioning, because that's critical. I mean, we may know it in our own minds, but how we communicate it to the public is critical, because people are going to automatically see it as a decline, as a negative. Already we have all over the place America in decline. You know, lifestyles, we're not going to have the same lifestyle that we've had. Put in a negative spin. The same message could be put into a positive framework.
I think one of the great advantages at looking at the 13.7 or 8 billion years of deep time past is every time a turn on the spiral occurred, there was a tendency to higher consciousness, greater freedom, and more complex order. In other words, a built-in tendency to something better. And I believe that part of what we can do by putting in that which is already creative toward that, just starting with the emerging world already happening, we would have, I'm not just joking about a strange attractor, it's attractive. And we are so aware of breakdown, but nobody is fully aware of what's emergent, innovations in every field. And one glimpse of that would then encourage more. And I really believe that that is a major co-creative act that could happen, because we all know this and we're all here in terms of all on earth. And we also have a nervous system to connect us. And probably the truth is everybody's unique part is essential to the new whole, but can't be seen unless it's connected. So this would be a place for organic unity to take place and be encouraged by all of us in a new way.
Regarding this question of communication, I'd like to draw on an analogy. When Swami Vivekananda was asked about the difference between religion and spirituality, he said, when each person follows his own religion, that is spirituality. And we recognize in that the need for recognizing each person as unique and having unique needs. And so when the question of communication comes, I would paraphrase this to say, each one needs to be addressed uniquely. We can't expect the same language to work for everybody. And so when I look at the world from this perspective, I see that every effort out there is already contributing uniquely in the way needed for that group, for that person at that moment. What's missing is the recognition that all these efforts are serving a purpose. We tend to view an effort which is different from ours as wrong or not helpful or contradictory. But if we can bring in that perspective that yes, it requires a multifaceted, multidimensional approach to communication, and we see them all as fulfilling that purpose already, and then evolving to keep up with changing circumstances. We see that whenever there's a gap, where there's something not fulfilled, eventually something finds its way and fills that niche also. And so one could even, to use your wording, one could even say the planetary consciousness is finding its way to communicate. And all it requires is for us to acknowledge that, and then perhaps the next step would come spontaneously to assist that.
One of the ways, too, is to approach it negatively again. We have the extraordinary phrase in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. Where'd that come from? But that's what the great Western philosophers say is the purpose of life. So we can start by asking people, okay, be honest, are you happy? And if people are honest, and that's not guaranteed, they'll say no, just by getting a bigger house or a better job. So once again, to appeal to what's deep inside, and to suggest a greater connection, a greater expansiveness, greater possibility in life in spiritual values beyond ego concerns and survival concerns. To awaken it in people from that point of view and from that point of access.
I just want to also give a shout out for Awakening the Dreamer and Pachamama and Bill and Lynn Twist and their work. And it's part of these collective awakenings. So
David had a question.
If we look back over the sweep of history, much of human history has been defined by conflicts between religions and philosophies, my God versus your God, or my philosophy versus your philosophy, and by competition over resources between classes, between peoples. Now, as I've heard about the work of the interfaith community through Dina and the Contemplative Alliance, I am struck by the way you described that we came together as people of different faiths, first with the idea that we need to speak to each other, to understand each other, to become more tolerant of one another's beliefs. But that as that conversation has unfolded, it has increasingly converged on the idea at the deepest level we all share the same fundamental belief. It strikes me that there are some powerful lessons in that, and I'd love to hear you share your insights into that conversation. What have you learned from it, and what are the lessons for carrying forward the larger human conversation, recognizing, as many of you have mentioned, and as all of us are clearly aware from our own experience, that during the lifetime of each one of us, we have moved from the reality of separation that has characterized humans from the beginning of time to now a situation where for the first time we can think and act as a global species. But the lessons of this interfaith conversation are foundational to making the leap from separate people who can talk to each other to separate people that share a vision of humanity and the future of creation and the human place in it.
When I was at one of the parliaments of the world's religions, I posed a question which I think is a very vital one, would be to each faith, what do you sense to be your unique contribution to the evolution of humanity and Earth life? And it's a very interesting question to find out, and that's true for individual humans as well, your unique contribution. But to think of the great faiths, they have fundamental assumptions that are the same, they are different, but they all perhaps have a uniqueness that together would be part of the huge attractor for humanity.
I think the best thing about interreligious dialogue, of which the Parliament has been a huge force, but is the fact that we're now saying, as Dina began, it's not just, is my God, is my sense of spirit the same or different from yours? It's, what are we going to do for the future of the Earth community? That's what's so important, but we have a lot to build on.
I've had the very good fortune to grow up in an interfaith context since early childhood, exposed to the presence of priests and rabbis and lamas. They were all friends of my father, and had the chance sometimes to hear them talk and to take in their chants and follow their meditation. So I feel very fortunate in that regard, and I believe these opportunities are opening up to more and more people in our time. And for me, that has not been inconsistent with the task of going deeply into one tradition. I have felt the necessity to do so, but have never felt that in my own deepening study and practice of the Sufi tradition in the context of the Islamic sources of Sufism, that this negated the great conviviality, respect that I have felt in the Commonwealth of All Faiths. And what I have experienced in those conversations between people of all faiths is that there are many differences in belief and practice, and we shouldn't too easily gloss over those differences. Again, that goes back to the secular approach to diversity, which, since it doesn't take the religion so seriously anyway, has trouble seeing why religious people are so intolerant, because after all, it's just it's a cultural relic, and one is as good as another. But the people who take it seriously believe so deeply in those things that they have a tendency toward intolerance. So I'm trying to reconcile those two impulses in myself, and take it deeply seriously, and at the same time see that they can all be expressions of one encounter with the numinous. And so what is it that they have in common? I would highlight 3 areas. One is that they all have an ethical code, and that ethical code is elaborated in each case, and sometimes in a very culturally specific way. But if you get down to the foundation of all of those ethical codes, it expects reciprocity in human dealings. It expects that you treat others as you would be treated by yourself. All of the religions maintain this, and they maintained it in an era in which there wasn't a legal system which would enforce these codes. And so it was a profound contribution to human society that these things were taught and upheld by religion. The other thing that they have in common is a mode of practice, of contemplation, of prayer, of ritual, all of these methods that attune a human being and bring us back to the encounter with the essential structure of the cosmos, reflection upon the seasons and the fecundity of the earth and our embeddedness in the whole of it, and our rootedness in transcendence, in a great mystery. So methods through breath and through posture and other methods that lead to this opening of the mind beyond the merely rational mode of knowing. And thirdly, this contemplative practice leads to an apprehension of the sacred, which is to say, not taking for granted the mundane world as merely a place in which to do one's business, but to see the universe as a context by which reality is discovering itself. So the sense of the sacred is an affirmation that all that exists is part of a mystery that is profound, that's worthy of the greatest veneration and awe and celebration. So these 3 aspects, I believe, are common to all of the faiths.
I think just as sometimes for an individual, sometimes it's tremendous suffering that opens a door to letting go of smugness and pride and a feeling of superiority and invulnerability and so on. And it just cracks open and you realize how vulnerable you are and how life can change. And that can be a kind of push toward more connection to others, to more compassion for others and so on. And I think almost collectively in many cases, given the degree and the intensity of the suffering that people and the creatures that life is facing right now, I think that there's a kind of dissolution of a lot of boundaries and a feeling of, well, my way is better. And it's like, really, who cares, at some point, because we need help. Everybody needs some help. And so I think it's kind of the beautiful side in some ways of the degree of the threat or the sense of danger is that so many assumptions about ourselves and separation can fall away, and we can come together in a different way.
We're going to have to go to closing statements. Do you want to say something quickly, Michael?
Just quickly, yes. I found in my own case that the first requirement for interfaith dialogue is to deepen your own tradition, deepen your experience of your own tradition, and that depth at the one and the same time makes it more attractive to people that might attract them to investigate it themselves and not just say you have to do this. And also, the deeper your own experience of your own tradition, the more you are attracted to see the beauty and the wisdom in other traditions as well. So just respectfully explore in a deep way these various traditions.
Barbara and Mary Evelyn, do you want to just take a minute to make any closing comments?
I think for me, the sum of this is the context in which we are now gathered as the human species at a time of possible crisis and destruction of our whole system by our acts. So we're responsible and we know it. And at the same time, toward the emergence of something that none of us have fully seen before. So the core of the spiral of evolution coming from the mind of God, having been the consciousness force through all of it, I think it's a period of massive incarnation of the impulse in evolution that people will not even know what name to call it if they're not an existing religion. And if we, in this interfaith dialogue, can set a context so inclusive that everyone who feels the impulse of that spiritual force of evolution coming through them in their desire to create and to express, if we're a call not only to the interfaith, but to the intercommunity of humanity to give our gift to the shift of humanity, I think that that might be a very shared act, not only how we go horizontal with each other, but how we're a call. And by making a call to all humanity, because ultimately it's a spiritual call.
Thank you. Just very quickly, coming back to the title here, laying the ground of the Sacred Earth Community Narrative, I think part of what we've been saying is that the ground has been laid, the seeds are being planted, I think, and that's over the last several decades with a lot of work in interreligious dialogue and interdisciplinary conversations that have gone on. The question is, we still need to till the soil, we still need to water those seeds and cultivate both ourselves and this process. But I think we're all aware that we're in this period of looking for alternative energies, and that in our desperation, we are destroying the earth, whether it's tar sands or mountaintop removal and so on. And the irony is this rapid and relentless devastation of our planet for new sources of energy needs to be shifted, as we are discussing here, to realizing the ultimate renewable source of energy is a spiritual energy. And we have leaders, we have participants who can guide us in this conversation, and especially because they have great humility in doing this. So that spiritual energy is part of building ourselves forward to realizing we belong here. We've always belonged here. This is our home, and it's the home of all living creatures. But welcoming this spiritual energy.
Before we break and move into the next session, I want to close by saying that the reason we wanted this to be the first panel is to highlight that an alchemy is taking place. The spread of contemplative practice outside monastic communities is relatively new. It's only in the last 100 years that lay people have taken up with such dedication a variety of meditation and contemplative practices, and that is going to bear results, is bearing results, and that is part of the hope for the change, and how we can now enable that to maybe reflect more itself in society is our challenge, which we'll discuss more tomorrow. But the spiritual landscape is changing, and since I've been involved in this interfaith work for 15 years, I've seen a dramatic change, in moving from tolerance to respect to love, appreciation, and shared practice. And it's the shared practice which has, I think, had the greatest impact. The sharing of practices, the coming together in practice, the seeing the unity. And that's the dramatic shift in the interfaith work that is changing the spiritual landscape, which will give rise to multiple other changes, social changes. So we're going to end with a moment of silence, and then we have a 5-minute bathroom break. Not necessary to go to the bathroom if you don't have to. You can sit quietly or chat, but we'll convene again in 5 minutes.